Hi, I'm Jennifer Isom-Schmidtke, and I'll be talking about emotion. So the first thing we should do is establish what neuroscientists think an emotion is. So it's generally been agreed that an emotion has three components: a physiological reaction, a behavioral response, and a conscious or subjective feeling of that emotion, and that has a valence that is either positive or negative. So for an emotion like anger, the physiological reaction would be the increase in heart rate, the faster breathing, the increased blood pressure, those things that are consistent with a sympathetic nervous system response of fight. The behavioral response might be increased muscle tension, but it also includes the facial expression that goes with that emotion. And then last, the conscious subjective feeling of anger is just feeling mad or being angry. So what is the point of emotions? Why do we have them? Well, Darwin thought that emotions provided a survival advantage for members of a species. So those advantages could be greater arousal in situations that needed greater arousal, like being attacked by a saber-toothed tiger or having to run. Another advantage would be the ability to recognize and better learn those things in the environment that are potentially very rewarding, that will sustain life, and those that are punishing, like snakes. So the current belief of emotion is that it is not just a luxury that enhances our lives. It's really something that we cannot afford to live without. We would not be able to survive without it. So now we know what emotion is and why it's important. But do all people experience the same emotions? And are there basic emotions? Darwin studied emotions extensively, especially the facial expression of emotions, and he argued that emotions are innate and they have a biological basis. So they should be universal across cultures for humans. He even suggested that similar emotions could be observed across species. So for example, in the picture here, the top picture, you can see the dog who's showing anger with the upturned lip and baring of the teeth. And you see the woman below with similar facial expression with the upturned lip and the baring of the teeth. Paul Ekman has spent his whole career studying emotions, and he finds that certain emotions appear to be universally recognized and shared, historically, even in cultures that were not literate and who had no access to media that would have exposed them to facial expressions of other cultures. Now, the most commonly agreed upon emotions, there's anywhere between 6 and many more than 8, but usually 6 to 8, are anger, happiness, sadness, fear, disgust, surprise, and then there's some support for contempt and embarrassment. Another way emotions have been characterized is by describing them according to the ways people experience and react to them. Some argue that emotions are better understood not by looking at separate emotions, but by understanding the common dimensions that they all have. I've already mentioned one, and that's valence. Every emotion can be considered to be positive or negative, but also every emotion can be considered to be a high intensity emotion or a low intensity emotion. So it varies in arousal, high versus low. Using those two dimensions, you can create something called an affect, which is another word for emotion, circumplex, where you have the two dimensions placed at 90-degree angles to each other. So here's the first dimension, aroused and unaroused. This is high intensity and low intensity down at the bottom. And the other dimension is the valence, so unpleasant or bad, negative, versus pleasant or positive. Now, all of these in the middle are just combinations. So up here are the high intensity, high arousal, and positive emotion. Opposite to that are the low arousal and unpleasant emotions. Every one of those emotions that I just mentioned, that are the 6 basic emotions, in fact, every emotion can be plotted somewhere on this affect circumplex. So using these dimensions, you could plot anger in the high arousal and unpleasant area of the circumplex. Similarly, happiness, which is a pleasant emotion, could be plotted in this area, the high arousal, pleasant affect. Sadness, on the other hand, is an unpleasant and unaroused or low arousal emotion, so it could be plotted in this area. Investigating brain function related to these two dimensions has been more useful than investigating brain function related to the 6 or 8 or however many there are, basic emotions already mentioned. So scientists have tried to figure out how we experience emotions. What do we experience first, the physiological part of the emotion or the subjective feeling of the emotion? This is yet to be completely understood, but there are three main theories that have addressed it. And the first one is the James Lange theory. According to the James Lange theory, each emotion has a specific physiological pattern of response. What happens is when we perceive an emotional stimulus with our sensory system, it triggers activity in the autonomic nervous system, the fight or flight system. There's a non-conscious automatic interpretation of that bodily response, and that's what leads to the subjective feeling of an emotion. So an emotion is not caused by our perception of an emotion-evoking event, but by a bodily response to that stimulus. William James is quoted as saying, "We feel sorry because we cry, angry because we strike, and afraid because we tremble." The Cannon-Bard theory hypothesizes that the subjective feeling of an emotion and the physiological response occurs at the very same time and without being dependent on each other. So an emotional stimulus is sensed, and that information goes to the thalamus, and then it's sent to the hypothalamus, where it evokes an autonomic nervous system response, fight or flight, and to the brain at the same time. And that's where the subjective feeling of the emotion occurs. So unlike William James's theory, emotions do not have specific patterns of physiology. It is the cortex, or the higher brain, that is responsible for the identification of the emotion. The last theory to address how we experience emotion is the Schachter-Singer theory, also called the Schachter two-factor theory. And that states that emotions are a result of physiological arousal combined with the cognitive appraisal of the situation. Whereas the James Lange theory hypothesized that the physiology is the most important part in identifying the emotion. And the Cannon-Bard theory said it's the cognitive appraisal that is the most important part in identifying the emotion. The Schachter-Singer theory says it's both. It's not only the physiological arousal, but it's also the cognitive appraisal of the situation that leads the person to identify and experience the emotion. So physiological arousal, according to the Schachter-Singer theory, contributes only to the emotion's intensity. So as an example, if you see a bear and your heart rate goes way up, you might interpret that as fear. If your heart rate is going really fast and you're looking at someone you're in love with, you might then interpret that as happiness or euphoria. In both cases, the bodily response is the same, but the emotion is determined by the cognitive appraisal of the situation. So just to recap, here are the three theories. In the James Lange theory at the top, you perceive there's a bear, your body has an autonomic nervous system response, where you have your heart pounding, you're trembling, you're sweating, and you begin to run. And because of that response, that physiological response, you identify that you're afraid. The Cannon-Bard theory states that you perceive the bear, and that information is sent both to your hypothalamus, which starts the autonomic nervous system response, and to your brain, higher cognitive parts of your brain, and that's where you identify that you are afraid. In the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory, your experience of fear is determined both by your physiological response, your heart pounding, you're trembling, you're sweating, and you're running away, but also your brain's appraisal of what's going on. It's a scary bear, and so you feel afraid. That realization, along with your bodily responses, leads you to feel fear. In the modern view of emotion, it's believed that emotions can vary considerably in the physiological arousal that each emotion elicits or is associated with. So, for example, the physiological arousal or bodily experience of happiness and fear vary quite a bit. So that sort of supports the James Lange theory. But what about anger and fear? Those can be argued to be very similar in terms of physiology. Both would involve an increased autonomic nervous system response with increased heart rate, increased blood pressure, you're breathing faster. And so the physiology doesn't seem to really differentiate those two emotions. And the research on this doesn't clearly identify different emotions by their patterns of physiological arousal. Anger and fear are emotions that require some cognitive appraisal to identify the emotion that you're feeling. So that is more supportive of the Schachter-Singer theory. It's also been shown that bodily feedback does impact our experience and our perceptions of emotion. For example, studies in which subjects were told to voluntarily move their facial muscles into configurations that resembled emotional faces without them realizing it, reported that they actually felt subjectively in a way that was consistent with those facial expressions. At the same time, they were measuring their patterns of autonomic arousal using heart rate, skin conductance, which measures the amount of sweat that is on your skin, and other autonomic nervous system measures. And they found that the autonomic arousal also changed for those facial expressions. So the subjects were given muscle by muscle instructions and coaching to produce facial configurations of muscles that were consistent with anger, fear, happiness, and sadness. And the instructions were given in a way that was designed to not let them in on the facial expressions they were creating. They also didn't allow the subjects to see their faces or know otherwise that they were modeling a particular emotion. But just putting their faces in the configurations that were similar to the facial expressions actually produced that emotion in those subjects. In a variation of that study, subjects were asked to hold a pencil or a pen in their teeth while making the movements to further throw off the idea that they were making emotional facial expressions. So they had them move their faces in a way that created an expression of sadness, happiness, anger, and fear. And their subjective feelings of emotion were, again, consistent with the muscle movements they were making. In other studies, where subjects were in a post-happy face, they tended to rate cartoons as being funnier. And in a study of making faces that are associated with pain, you see the pain face here, holding an expression that was consistent with feeling pain was also associated with a greater subjective experience of a painful stimulus. So just having that painful look on their face made them actually report that the pain that they experienced, the painful stimulus that they experienced, was more painful than when they made a neutral face. So if you're going in for a shot, it might be a good idea not to frown or make a sad face, because you could actually be making your pain worse. More evidence that bodily feedback influences our perceptions of emotion is the finding that women who have had Botox treatment actually report less negative mood and less depression. So one of the conclusions from this study is that limiting the ability to express an emotion also limits your ability to perceive that emotion. So since the facial muscles were paralyzed, those frown muscles were paralyzed, it led to weaker facial feedback for negative emotions. In other words, it's harder to maintain a bad mood when your face doesn't cooperate. Women who had Botox treatment were also asked to make angry expressions while their brain activity was measured. And they found that those who had Botox treatments also showed less activity in the amygdala than women who had not had Botox treatment. So these findings give support to the facial feedback hypothesis, or the idea that your facial expressions have an impact on your emotional experience. So physiological feedback provides information about the quality and the intensity of our emotions. So there's plenty of data that supports this hypothesis. It implies that maybe if you're in a bad mood, all you really need to do is to fake being in a good mood by putting a smile on your face, which would be a really simple way to improve your mood. So physiological feedback does give us information about the intensity of our moods and also has an impact on our judgment. So there was a study by John Bargh, a social psychologist, who had participants hold on to a cup of coffee briefly, or warm cup of coffee, and then they were asked to evaluate somebody, a target subject, and they found that those who briefly held that warm cup of coffee rated the target as much more positive than those who had held either a neutral cup of a beverage or a cold beverage. So the idea was that experience of the warm feeling also increased that individual's positive emotions, which had an impact on their judgment of that person. More evidence for this feedback in emotion comes from a researcher by the name of Amy Cuddy, and she studies leadership in business. She had students pose in different postures before a job interview, and she found that if you pose in a posture that is consistent with being powerful before the interview, those students had higher levels of testosterone, which is consistent with feeling more powerful. And those students who posed in a posture that was weak, that showed a weakness, actually had more levels of cortisol, a stress hormone. So that led her to the idea that you should fake it until you make it, because actually just playing that role makes you more powerful. Other evidence for this feedback hypothesis is that quadriplegics report that over time, after the injury that caused the quadriplegia, report diminished emotions or blunted affect. And it's thought the reason for this is because their brains are no longer getting that feedback in constructing their emotional experiences. And so that weaker feedback leads to diminished responses or diminished emotions. So it's clear that the brain uses physical feedback in constructing and maintaining our emotions.